Well, hi everybody. Welcome to my webinar. We've got a fantastic roll-up today. We've got people from all over the world, which is fantastic. I'm broadcasting this webinar from Brisbane in Australia. We've got public sector organisations, private sector organisations, small businesses, large businesses. We've got consultants. So obviously this topic is topical, and I hope you enjoy the next hour of presentation. So if you've got any questions, as I'm sure you probably have, if you cast your eyes to the right-hand side, you'll notice there that there's an opportunity for you to type in any questions. So what I'm intending to do is to take questions at the end of the presentation, so that when you think of a question as it comes up, just type it in there so that we can hit the ground running, so to speak, at about 10:02. So that'll give us an opportunity to answer a whole stack of your questions without interrupting the broadcast as such. Okay, so let's get underway. Okay, there are basically three things that I'd like to get out of the presentation, or what I'd like to cover in the presentation, and I'm hoping that gels with what you're here for. But I guess I want to talk a little bit around understanding why performance reviews are actually outdated and ineffective. You're probably aware that many organisations, many high-profile organisations, are now abandoning ratings or going the full way and actually abolishing their performance reviews. And I'll talk about some of those companies as we go through the presentation today. I guess the second thing is, and I'm sure many of you are here for this reason, is what are some of the strategies that you can use to shift from appraisals to development? Because it's not an easy shift. Appraisals have been around for a long time, whilst most people aren't necessarily predisposed to them. They also accept that they're part of the kind of human resources framework. And I'd like to then talk a little bit about the 5 Conversations framework, which is a framework that I put together that is very popular, and one that people are now using either as a substitute for the performance appraisal or to actually shift from an appraisal to a review process. So there are 3 things basically I'd like to cover in this presentation. So you can see on the screen there's some very well-known companies, and you may wonder, well, what have they all got in common apart from the fact that they're international organisations, and the organisations that some of the products and services we use, but all of them have made the decision over the last 6 months to abolish their performance reviews. So we'll talk a little bit about those in more detail. Here's a couple of reflections on those organisations. For example, General Electric has now decided to abolish what they call the rank and yank system, which is basically assigning employees to a performance score relative to their peers, so using a bell curve type of approach. And in quite a ruthless way, those that perhaps end up on the lowest percentile get fired. So they've abolished that system. So that's one example. Another example is an organisation, and this organisation's got 330,000 employees, and basically their CEO is talking about a massive revolution, which is basically about personalising employee feedback and actually abolishing the performance evaluations and rankings. So they've basically got rid of their ranking system as such. Microsoft, they've overhauled their own performance management process, and they're moving in this direction as well. So they've made that decision in the last 6 months to do that. And I like this quote. It pretty much sums up my view, which is the Google HR manager, who basically says performance management, as practiced by most organisations, has been a rule-based bureaucratic process existing as an end in itself rather than actually shaping performance. Employees hate it, managers hate it, even HR departments hate it. which kind of sums up the view that a lot of people have about the review system. Having said that, though, there are lots of people that still believe that the performance review is an important plank in the HR framework. So I guess this is probably a statement I just want you to have a think about for a moment, because it's an interesting kind of contradiction. If we want employees working together, not competing with one another, and that is towards achieving common goals, then removing ratings has to be a good start. So if on the one hand we're involved in team building and collaboration, and we're empowering people and we're enabling people to do their job, but then on another scale we're actually rating each other or each employee against their particular other people, well, it's not a good thing. So maybe just a thought about that, that really the competition, if there is such a thing as a competition, is really a competition between, well, it's not a competition between people, it's a competition of the person against themselves. In other words, how can they actually improve the process as such? So that becomes quite, it's a good starting point to think about. So what's actually wrong with the performance appraisal? Well, there are a number of things wrong with it, and I interviewed 1,400 HR managers in this part of the world, in Australia and Southeast Asia and New Zealand, and I simply asked the HR managers what they considered, what their concerns were about the performance review. And here's what some of them said. In fact, these are the themes that are coming through. Many of them commented about how costly the exercise was when you consider that we're downing tools once, twice, and sometimes 4 times a year to actually conduct a review, not to mention the fact that we have to prepare for that review, and that is both the employee and the manager themselves, and the opportunity costs that are lost from completing the performance review when they could be doing other productive work. It actually does become quite a costly exercise. Secondly, and these aren't necessarily in order, they're just themes that came up in my research, that appraisals can be destructive. They're not always destructive, of course, but they can be. And I heard stories of HR managers having to sort out issues around bullying and harassment. Well, that's what the labels were. I'm not too sure it was actually the case after the review process, and it became quite destructive, which I think is really symptomatic of a poor relationship between the manager and the employee anyway, but the performance review certainly didn't help in that regard. Appraisals are usually a monologue rather than a dialogue, and that's the way it's set up, where basically the manager sits behind their large desk and the employee sits on the other side, although a lot of organisations now have abandoned that practice. The manager does most of the talking and the employee basically sits there and passively responds at different points during the process. So it's really more of a monologue than a dialogue. It's not really a conversation. And I know a lot of you have tried very hard to get your managers to actually have conversations, but I don't think that the performance review is the right tool for that, because you've got a form, you've got a whole lot of processes that have got to be filled out. Sometimes I've actually seen and heard of examples of managers not actually making eye contact throughout the appraisal process because they're too busy filling out the form. So it becomes really much more of a monologue than a dialogue, and that can't be productive. The formality of the appraisal stifles discussion, and particularly if the appraisal is linked with pay. So, and I'm a strong believer that appraisals should not be directly linked with pay. There's no reason why they shouldn't guide and inform the decision about pay, but to have it directly linked with that means that the appraisal system is not going to go particularly well, because there's a lot at stake. So the employee may not actually say what they think, and it kind of turns into a bit like a job interview. So the formality of it can be, the appraisal can stifle the approach because of the formality of it. They're also too infrequent. You know, once a year is like an eternity what can happen in the 12 months previous, there's a lot of water under the bridge, and so some companies have said, all right, well, let's do it twice a year, or in one case I heard the other day, let's do it 4 times a year. I still think that's too infrequent. It should be happening day by day, moment by moment, situation by situation, incident by incident, and so forth. So it should be happening all the time. It should be a seamless process that continues. And of course, a lot of managers save up all of their particular feedback until the appraisal time because they think that's the convenient space to actually provide people with feedback. And that feedback is highly ineffective because something could have happened 3 or 4 months ago and the employee interprets rightly, well, if it was that important, I would have heard about it at the time, whether it's positive or negative. So the frequency of it is a real issue. A lot of people perceive the appraisal as a box ticking exercise. People sit down and they fill out their appraisals, and basically what happens at the end of the process is HR runs around chasing people up for their appraisals, and all that does, of course, is reinforce the concept that really it's just an exercise in form filling. Of course, it should be a lot more than that, but that's the perception that a lot of people have, particularly the ones that I spoke to. They're rarely followed up. Usually what happens is they get put away in the electronic filing cabinet or in the filing cabinet itself, and it isn't referred to again until the next appraisal occurs, and the manager might have a cursory look through that appraisal just before the interview as a form of preparation, but nothing really happens and nothing really changes. And once the exercise is finished, people are just happy that it's over. They move on to other things. So there's not much follow-up. So really, in that sense, they're quite unproductive. And of course, it's very stressful. And you saw the quote there from the Google HR manager earlier. It's an exercise. Managers don't enjoy it. Employees don't necessarily enjoy it. HR don't enjoy it. It's quite a stressful time. And there's nothing wrong with having a bit of stress in the workplace. There's plenty of it anyway, but why should we add to that if it's not actually being productive? So there are a number of reasons why I think the traditional performance appraisal is not working. And I think I'd probably say to you that from my experience, there's probably 3 groups out there. There's one group that think that the performance reviews are actually fine. They're working very well. Their view is that it's the managers conducting them that's the problem. And what can happen is that they believe that if they provide more training around having or conducting the performance reviews, how to fill out the forms, making the forms more useful, making them more user-friendly, if that occurs, then the appraisal system should work well. So there's a group of people out there that believe that. That's quite a large group, but I think that group is diminishing in size. I think the tool is the whole idea of the performance review is the problem, but a lot of people think that that's not the problem. It's really something that can be remedied by making the appraisal system more effective. There's another group of people out there that believe that performance reviews would be better if we improved the process. In other words, and this is more around the paperwork and so forth, but there's essentially nothing wrong with it, and they're quite strong supporters of the appraisal system. Those people, I think, are in the minority, but there's a lot of people out there that still strongly defend the use of the appraisal system. And I think that there is another group of which I belong, and perhaps some of you belong, and that is the group that think we need to get rid of them, that they're really a relic of the last century. There's something that's not working, and then the question is, what do we replace it with? If we know our reviews aren't working, and our reviews on our reviews demonstrate that they're not working, then what do we actually replace them with becomes the dilemma. So I think essentially that's where most people fall between, one of those 3 groups, if you like. So let's look at this a little bit further. So in terms of leadership and management, we've obviously moved and evolved from a command and control, or we should have at least, from a command and control mindset to a more of adaptive leadership approach, where we're dealing with things in an adaptive, flexible way. And if leadership is moving in that direction, and I'm sure you would all agree that that's how it should be moving, although it's fair to say there's a lot of managers who still believe very much in the command and control mindset, then with this adaptive approach, there are a number of micro skills, if you like, that managers need to put into place. One of those is the ability to collaborate, so collaborative problem solving, to work with people, to collaborate with them, is a core competency now. The capacity to get the very best from the people that work for you and your team now becomes an important part of adaptive leadership. So if you talk to a good manager or a good leader and you ask them what they think their role is about, you'll probably find that most of those good leaders will say it's really about developing the potential of other people to be able to utilize their strengths and abilities in a much better way. Another adaptive leadership skill is the ability to coach, and this isn't necessarily coaching people on technical competence. It could well be about managing situations and people, but a good adaptive leader is a good coach, and they'll know when to use the coaching methodology. And I guess leaders now don't have, they've certainly got the rank, if you like, but now it's all about influencing rather than basically saying to people, well, you know, I'm the boss, do as I say. So obviously, as we evolve and move and change, it requires a different form of leadership. And I think we're probably in flux between the old and the new. But the performance review actually reinforces the command and control mindset, if you think about it. Because performance reviews essentially are about control. That is, a way of actually controlling the output of employees by rating them, by having a considerable amount of power over the employee, by giving them some sort of form of score which indicates whether or not they get a pay rise. So I think performance reviews are not applicable in an adaptive leadership environment. And of course, we've got problem solving as well, group problem solving, dealing with complex issues on the spur of the moment and taking the team with you. So there are lots of adaptive micro skills that managers and leaders now need. So I made a statement in my latest book, which is Conversations at Work. I've made this statement with my co-author, Aubrey Warren, and I'm basically making this statement that organisations are really conversations. There are hundreds, thousands, or even tens of thousands of conversations that go on in an organisation every day. Some of them go on in the lunchroom, some of them go on in the boardroom, some of them go on in the office, some of them even go on in the bathroom. But these are conversations that people have every day. And I'm very concerned when I hear people talking about the art of conversation. I don't actually think there's an art to it. I think it's just having the conversation. I have no doubt that the difficult conversations are more difficult and people shy away from those, and there are some skills that are very useful there. But my experience is that the quality of the conversations that people have in organisations has a very much a strong impact on the productivity of an organisation. So what we should be really trying to promote is a conversation culture, one where people are willing to discuss things. And of course, technology is a wonderful thing, but this can often get in the way where it seems very easy just to press a button, send an email, copy several people in, and we're done. We've had our conversation in inverted commas. It's not really a conversation, as we know. So really, if we break this right down, your organisation or the organisations you work with are really a collection of people all working towards a common cause. And people often say to me, oh, yes, but our organisation is quite unique or quite different. I would say that perhaps what they do is unique and perhaps different, but people fundamentally have the same needs. And it doesn't matter what organisation we're talking about. it's people that we're really at the core of the organisation. So it really is all about the people. So if the old cliche that people are our competitive advantage is actually true, then we've got to actually engage more in conversations. And there's several myths around performance reviews, and there's several myths around performance that I'd like to cover. Some of those myths, I think we should debunk those straight away before we move on. One of the myths is that if you can increase the performance of an individual, and ultimately you can increase the performance of, say, all of the individuals, then that will automatically translate into an increase in performance in the organisation. That's not true, because it's the interdependency between people that's the critical thing. So it's the systems that people operate in, the human systems, the technical systems, the administrative systems. That's where real organisational performance starts and finishes. Give you a very simple example. I could be very punctual getting my reports in, but if I'm not getting the information from another section in the organisation on time, then my performance is going to suffer, because I'm not going to be able to get information in on time, and if I do, it won't be quality information. So that's about the interdependency between people and systems. So the suggestion that by just increasing everybody's individual performance will increase the organisation performance isn't necessarily the case. Another myth is that we need performance reviews because this is our way of objectively categorising people. But there's nothing objective about it. Just because we're giving people a number doesn't mean it's objective. It's still based on observations. It's still based on, in often the case, is unconscious bias. So if we give the person a 3 out of 5, we're doing that based on our own observations and how we relate to that person. So the suggestion that we're being very objective about it is untrue. It's still based very much on an opinion, and often those opinions, of course, are misguided. What makes that worse, of course, is that a lot of people don't like giving ratings of 5 out of 5, and they don't like giving ratings of a 1 out of 5. So what they tend to do is to give a person a rating in the middle. So they don't want to rock the boat. There's nothing objective about that at all. Myth number 3 is managers are in the best position to make judgments about people's performance. Look, sometimes they are and sometimes they're not. But to suggest that managers, have this incredible wisdom that they can actually make decisions about people's performance is naive. And that's why 360-degree feedback is so popular, because it gives a number of sources an opportunity to have an input. And if there's a common thread running through that feedback, then there may well be some validity to it. But managers don't always get it right. And of course, the performance review is very much geared towards the manager's opinion or view. Performance reviews enhance individual performance. I have yet to see any research anywhere in the world that I've come across that definitively demonstrates that the performance review process actually enhances employee performance. I've never seen it. And I don't believe, in fact, I'd go so far as to say it's actually detrimental, not so much a positive enhancement. So that's a myth that we operate in. Another myth is that performance reviews are designed to help employees. Well, they're not. They're there to appraise employees. You can't really appraise an employee and develop them in the same meeting. We just don't have enough time. So we default to giving people scores rather than talking about how somebody might improve their performance. So there's some significant issues there around myths around performance reviews. The other thing that I think is very important is that, this might sound like a provocative statement, but I don't think it is. The roles that people play in organisations are now more important than the jobs that they actually do. So let me just unpack that for a little bit and talk about what I mean by roles. So if we just build up, so if we talk about the work that people do, there's essentially 2 types of work that people do. There's their job role. So basically the job role is captured in a work document which we call a job description. Essentially what the job role does is it covers the technical requirements of the role. And the job description does that reasonably well, if it's written properly, of course, but there's a whole bunch of other roles that are missing. And these roles are actually fundamental to organisational performance. And the job description is not really geared towards looking at these roles. So what are these roles? So these are what I call non-job roles, and there's been a lot of people out there looking at these non-job roles, and they understand they're important, but they haven't quite got a universal handle on what are the key roles that all industries need in order to perform. So what I've done is I've identified 4 that I believe are critical, that every single employee, irrespective of what industry you're in, should be playing. They should be performing these roles on a regular basis. One of those roles is to have a positive mental attitude and enthusiasm. And I'm not suggesting by that people should be bouncing off the walls, but I don't believe that they necessarily should be negative and undermining either. And I think that often when we challenge people on the basis of their attitude, they'll often revert back to their job description and say, well, it's not actually written in my job description anywhere to be that. And I guess they've got a point. The job description doesn't normally capture that information. Another role that's critical is we're expecting people to operate in teams. So, whether it's police or orchestras or whatever, we actually expect people to operate in a team environment. Organisations are less hierarchical. People are expected to operate in teams. That's a critically important role. So a person that's got high technical skills, that is, they're actually conducting their job role and performing that at a high level, but they're not actually team players, can be a problem. And I'm sure all of you can think of people like that. Another role we expect people to play is a career role. And by a career role, what I mean by that is continually upgrading and developing their own expertise. But there are a lot of people, aren't there, out there in the world of work who actually have made that decision to stop learning. So they've got their degree, or they've got their qualification, they've got their apprenticeship done, and they've basically decided to stop learning. Those people are not an asset to the organisation, nor are they an asset to themselves. That's a role. We want people to continually grow and develop in their particular job that they're performing. Another role, and the 4th role, the final role, is that we're expecting people to come to work and to give some sort of input into how the organisation can be better equipped, how they can do things better, faster, easier, safer. We actually want to capture that information. And I think that that's a fundamental non-job role of an employee right now. But those 4 roles that I've got there on the right-hand side, you can see, are not normally covered in the job description. There is a movement towards doing that, and I note that some job descriptions do include non-job roles, but normally they're at the end of the document, usually in bullet point form. They're not written in any sort of tangible way, and the implication is that these non-job roles are discretionary. The key thing is to do your technical role effectively. So if we're wanting to shift from performance appraisal to performance development, then we've also got to take into account the non-job roles that I've mentioned there. I have no doubt there are many other roles that people play in organisations that are critically important, but those 4 I would challenge anybody are important in any industry, in any occupation. Unless you're working on a desert island on your own, it's likely that those roles would be critically important to performance. Can you imagine what an organisation would be like if everyone was walking around with a negative attitude, and they were walking around, they weren't team players, everyone had stopped growing, and nobody had any thoughts or ideas or inspiration about how the organisation could be better off? That would be a serious impediment to an organisation's performance. So that's another avenue, if you like, for development of an employee as such. And just to underline my point about this is a survey that was conducted. 9,000 people were involved in this in 12 countries, and there was a simple question asked of the managers. So the managers were involved in this, and it was a simple question: what is the number one attribute that you are expecting from your employees? That was the question. And what you can see on your screen there is the top 10 in terms of frequency. So these were the 10 attributes that managers believed were critically important in the success of employees in their organisational roles. And what's striking about that list is that middle column. There is nothing on that middle column that's technical. Technical is a given. I'm not suggesting for a minute that technical is not important. Of course it is. We expect people to have competency when they come to your workplace. But what's interesting about all of those things is they're all non-job roles. So there's obviously a huge value placed on the non-job roles that I've just been through, and many of those that I've run through, of course, are on the list there as well. Okay, so what I would like to do now is just talk a little bit around a couple of approaches that you might use. I think that organisations often say to me that we need to have training in having conversations, and I accept that some people find conversations more difficult than others. But can you imagine for a moment saying to your parents or grandparents, or if they're still alive, and actually saying to them, look, guess what? We're having training on having conversations in our workplace. I think they'd find that quite amusing. In other words, we have shifted so far away from just talking to each other in the workplace that now we have to implement training programs in order to get people to talk to each other. And, I think that's an interesting insight into where we are in the world of work. So we need to set up a mechanism where people will actually regularly, consistently, and meaningfully have conversations with each other. Now, this is just one of many frameworks. It's my framework, but there are others out there. And this framework is a pretty simple framework, but a very important one. And those companies that have actually implemented this have got enormous benefit from it. And organisations that have implemented this are everything from law firms through to manufacturing, blue-collar environments, public sector, private sector, but they're getting tremendous value out of it because it is a framework to shift the focus from appraising to developing. So I just want to briefly run through this process. Some of you would have been familiar with this, some of you would have purchased my book, but bear with me. I just wanted to run through and give you a little bit of an overview of how this might operate. So you'll notice over on the left-hand side there is 5 months. So it's a 5-month cycle. So you might say, well, why is it 5 months? Well, there are 5 conversations. You might say, well, why is there 5? Well, we could have more, but I think these 5 conversations are critically important for all the reasons that I've mentioned previously. So what happens after the 5th month? Well, after the 5th month, there's a break of a couple of months, and then we encourage organisations to go through the cycle again. So they go through 2 cycles of the 5 conversations twice a year. I often get feedback and people say, well, we don't have time to be sitting around talking to each other. I should stress that each of these conversations are 10 to 15 minutes in duration. Now, if they go longer, it's by choice. In other words, the manager and the employer have decided to continue, but there are only a couple of questions for each particular particular conversation. So it's not a difficult process. And we start from a fairly easy process where we have a climate review. So essentially the first question that the manager would ask in that approach would be, on a scale of 1 to 10, at the moment, how would you rate your current job satisfaction? The employee might say 6, and then the manager would ask why, and then it would go on from there. Now, that gives the manager instant gauge on how their team is feeling at that particular time. Then they move on to morale and they move on to communication. These conversations are recorded and the employee comes to the conversations having prepared. So we've turned the pyramid upside down and it's the actual employee who does the preparation online. So they will actually think about what they would rate their current job satisfaction, for example. They would actually make a statement as to why they would feel it's that, and then they would come into the conversation environment with that information. So the conversation should run very smoothly. Once we've done that conversation, we have a strengths and talents conversation. So this is based on the positive psychology movement of the last 25 years. Let's start focusing on what people are good at, their innate talents, rather than what they're not good at, which is essentially where the performance review goes. So let's talk about people's strengths. Again, the employee comes to this conversation having thought about one strength that they have. And normally their strength is something that they enjoy doing in the workplace, and they share that with the manager and that's discussed. The upshot of that conversation is around how that manager may be able to facilitate a process where they could use that strength in a greater capacity in their current or even future roles. Now that's not always possible, but at least the conversation's occurred and the manager can agree or disagree, and they can also think about how they might utilise that. So for example, if somebody's very good with customers, yet they're in the back room and they very rarely, if ever, see a customer, and they mention that one of their strengths is that customer interface, then it puts the onus on the manager to think how might they change their particular internal processes to allow that person to actually utilise their strength to a greater capacity. Month 3 is opportunities for growth, which is probably the most difficult of the 5 conversations because essentially we're focusing on things that the employee can improve. But again, the employee comes to that conversation having considered an area for improvement, and the manager will either agree with that or disagree with that, and they'll have their conversation. And it's very much in a developmental frame of how that particular manager can assist that employee to develop that particular opportunity for growth. Learning and development comes next, and if you're talking about strengths and you're talking about opportunities, then there will be some L&D opportunities that will arise, and a lot of those aren't necessarily about sending people off to a program. It's often around coaching or developing in the workforce some of those adaptive skills I talked about earlier. And finally, the final conversations around innovation and continuous improvement. Again, the employee comes prepared with one particular idea, and it's really exciting to consider that if, let's say, you've got an organisation of 100 people, just as a round number, that you're going to have 100 conversations going on in month 5, let's say that's October. In month 5, there are 100 conversations going on around the organisation about ways and means of improving the organisation. Not all those ideas will be practical, but law of averages, there'll probably be half a dozen really great ideas that are easy to implement, and that's how you create that learning environment. And that's about developing the organisation. So in a nutshell, that's the 5 conversations framework. But as I say, there are other programs, there are other frameworks out there that you can do that. But I would say to you this, that it's really important to have some framework in place. It's no good just talking about conversations and development and expecting people to do them. They'll default to busyness and they'll miss the opportunities that are there to have these conversations. So you essentially need some sort of a framework to make that happen. Now, I won't go into this in great detail, but you'll notice on the screen is a screenshot of the website. So this is where people can go and prepare for their conversations. It records all their conversations. You've got opportunities to print the questions if you're out in the field. You can send reminders to people. You can get status reports and so forth. The managers have a dashboard to be able to determine how their progress is going with their conversations. The HR people have a wider dashboard which gives them an opportunity to look across the organisation at what the issues are, what's coming up. There's an opportunity there for action plans as well to be developed. So we have found that implementing the 5 conversations without some sort of a support mechanism is likely to fail. You just need a system in place to do that, and we have a system in place to do that. But anyway, if you'd like more information about that, I'm happy to talk with you offline. The other support mechanism that we provide is we do actually have a one-day workshop which we have implemented based on our new book, Conversations at Work, Promoting a Culture of Conversation in a Changing Workplace. And this is very much the nuts and bolts about how to have conversations, how to listen attentively, how to ask sensible questions, how to paraphrase, when to have the conversations, what sort of conversations should take place. They're not all negative. Some of them are encouraging conversations. Some of them are delegation conversations. So there's a one-day workshop that we've put together for those organisations that are interested in building the literacy up in their organisations around conversations. So if you'd like more information about that, of course, I'm more than happy to talk to you if you just send me an email. So that probably brings us pretty much to the end of the presentation, and if you've got some questions there, please go ahead and put them into the chat box there. And I notice we've got a couple of questions, so actually we've got quite a few. I may not get through all of these, quite a few. So let's see if we can have a look at what we've got here. So first question, how can you implement a system in a public sector where the scope to sack under the performance staff? How do you manage self in the situation? Brett's asked that question. Look, what some public sector organisations have done is that they've said, well, look, let's keep the performance review in place. And what we'll do is we'll use a framework like the 5 conversations to enable a better performance review process. And the plan is to phase out the performance review after people have become very, very good at having conversations on a regular developmental basis. So I think, Brett, that's the answer. I think the answer is to supplement your performance review with a developmental process to get people used to the idea of talking to each other on a regular basis in a developmental way, which enables a far better, more productive performance review at the end. Thanks for the question. Somebody has to leave. Okay, that's fine. How are these conversations recorded? I think I've sort of covered that in a sense. They're recorded online, and so there is a record, and the recording, so what happens is the employee goes in initially and puts down their information, so they're well and truly prepared. So they're not sitting there blankly, and they're not blindsided by the questions. They know what questions are going to be asked. Now, after the conversation, the manager then has an opportunity to go into their portal and actually make some observations and comments based on 2 things. 1, the conversation that they've had, and 2, the information that the employee has inputted there initially. So there's a record, a permanent record that's kept there. Everyone gets a unique key, so it ensures that confidentiality is protected. So essentially, that's how the conversations are recorded. How do you think? Next question. How do you think performance will be reviewed if appraisals are abolished? Performance is reviewed daily, and it's done all the time. It's done incident by incident, moment by moment. It's done event by event. So the review process is informal. It's done by observing behaviour in the workplace, the manager downing tools at that time, and taking an opportunity to have a conversation with the other person. They might start the conversation, and we'd certainly go through this in our workshop. They might start the conversation by asking the person how they thought they actually went in completing that report, or how did they perform in that meeting, or whatever it might be. So get the other person to make a comment, then the manager can agree or they can respectfully disagree. they can do what they like, but ask the individual first what they think, and then basically the manager then can chip in. So it's not an appraisal, it's a developmental process. I think that's the answer. It's done moment by moment, done in the hallway, done in all sorts of environments, and done very informally. That's the culture we're trying to create. Thanks for the question. Okay. How do you link, there's another question here on how you link the performance review with performance remuneration. I think that's a separate conversation. I think remuneration should be a separate conversation. These conversations that we have should guide and inform the decision about remuneration, but they shouldn't be attached directly to it. So I believe that that's, if you like, a sixth conversation. That's a conversation that occurs beyond the scope of these developmental conversations. Okay, let's see if there's any other questions there before we finish up. Okay. Would it also be a case a selection process includes the skills required, e.g. the team member working under a continuous improvement environment? Look, the questions are generic enough for people to obviously talk about the work that's being done at the moment. But what the point about having developmental conversations is not about talking about a particular project per se. So you might use the project as a critical incident to talk about something that the employee did well or not so well, but this is not sitting down talking shop. This is about developing. This is about talking about the person and their own development. So you can weave into those conversations a whole range of subject matter that occurs in the workplace, so specific to that workplace. So somebody said to me the other day, and it was, I suppose in a way it was fairly humorous. They said, well, your 5 conversations framework seems a bit artificial. And I said, why do you think that? And they said, well, because you've got to, you're just reading out these questions and getting people to respond. And of course I gently pointed out that you don't read them out. I mean, they're there to give you an idea. You say them in your own way, but obviously you try and cover them. They're there as guides, if you like. So you don't actually sit there reading out the questions. You actually, just have a conversation with the other person. They're obviously there as a guide. So you can still weave in all of the important things that go with that. So guys, that's pretty much all the questions. If I've missed any, send me an email. You've got my email on the screen there, and by all means go in and have a look at the website, and the books are available. You can, if you're not sure where to get them, you send me an email. They're basically available in most bookstores, obviously Amazon. You can actually get them via me through my website as well. So you've got the opportunity to purchase those. If you're interested in the 5 Conversations framework, I'm more than happy to talk with you in more detail about that. And the one-day workshop, more than happy to talk. So thank you very much for your attendance. We've had a huge audience all over the world, and I'm hoping that you've been able to gain something from the presentation, and you can start to thoughtfully think about how you might create a culture of developmental conversations in your workplace and a framework that might assist you with that. So thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, and I wish you all the very best and look forward to talking to any of you one-on-one. Thank you.